Hi there. You're listening to Hypercast, an ADHD podcast. I'm Melissa, an ADHD coach and advocate.
Hi, I'm Brianna, an ADHD coach and soon-to-be therapist. We are here to explore all things ADHD, from unexpected challenges to unique strengths.
Join us as we share insights and strategies that empower you to live your best ADHD life.
Ready? Let's dive into today's episode.
Do you want to feel better, or do you want to keep justifying why you're doing what you're doing? Because sometimes the two are not compatible.
Okay, that peas. Oh my God.
Yes, this question is such a kick in the ass.
I want this on a throw pillow. I want this on a mural in neon lights.
Welcome back to Hypercast.
Welcome to Hypercast.
So today is episode 2 of 3 of our mindfulness series with Dr. Allan Donsky. What is today's theme, Brianna?
Authenticity and healing.
We're going to take this opportunity to watch the video. We're watching back as you're watching, and we're going to stop along the way and give some commentary.
Yeah, this is the special behind the scenes bonus DVD features. So without further ado, let's jump into it.
One thing you were talking about was that you had anxiety. You had negative things going through your head. A lot of people with ADHD deal with that negativity and those negative thoughts. How do we clear that negativity and that anxiety in order to actually clear the path for us to be able to be mindful?
I don't think so much in the way of clearing the path. Just as I can't empty my mind, I like the symbol of the yin-yang, the light and the dark. They mirror each other. They're the same shape. They have a smooth curve. There's a relationship between the two. And together, the yin and the yang make the whole. I think of it as restoring balance, and balance is a verb. There is always going to be, and I call it little L inside of me. There's little Allan, insecure, nerdy, stuttering. I was probably 2 years behind socially. I was awkward. And so I had to recognize, I had to see that as part of myself. I had to practice acceptance. A lot of what we do when we judge ourselves is, I'm not good enough because, fill in the blank, whatever you like. Mm-hmm. We are made imperfect because if we were perfect, there'd be nothing to look forward to. There'd be no growth.
Yeah.
If we knew everything and did everything, life would be completely boring.
I actually really love this from an ADHD perspective because, like, the worst thing in the world for someone with ADHD is for something to be boring. And if you can actually approach life with a mindset that one of my goals is just to grow as a person, grow in this world, grow in the things that I'm passionate about, those things actually lead to greater authenticity of the self.
Growth is always on my mind. I maybe have a weird view of friendships where I think that if you are helping them to grow and they're helping you to grow, then that is a beautiful friendship. And if that friendship is just stagnant, if they're expecting you to stay the same, or if they don't push you to learn, to grow, to be better, then it's not worth my time.
That's not weird. That's healthy.
Some people view friendship as like, oh, it's really important to like maintain the connections and stay friends and have that community. But I view it as an opportunity to grow. Like, I love having, like, surrounding myself with friends who push me, who challenge me, who encourage me to change and don't expect me to stay the same. And I don't know if that's an odd view of friendship, but it's not what I was taught that friendship was. It was more of like, oh, we'll support you in the hard times rather than like challenge you in the good.
Well, those who challenge you in the good can also support you in the difficult times.
That's the point. They're supposed to do both, right?
So the fact that we're not perfect, unfortunately, what the mind does is judge that in the false hope that somehow that'll motivate them. I made a mistake, so if I'm perfect, that'll be the solution. So what happens is we beat ourselves up over whatever it is, and everybody does this. I've done it. I saw it in my clinical work. Every human being I've met. We're our harshest critics. When we criticize ourselves, we push ourselves away. The parts of ourselves we don't like. We call it the unseen or the shadow. So we distance ourselves from ourselves. In the words of Brené Brown, the 4 self-conscious affects: shame, embarrassment, humiliation, and guilt. Nobody wants those. So we pull ourselves away from those aspects we don't like. But the problem is when I'm disconnected from myself, I'm not in relationship with myself. And if I'm not in relationship with myself, how can I heal? So this is where self-acceptance comes in.
Perfectionism and ADHD. ADHDers tend to have black and white thinking, that all or nothing thinking, which tends to lead to perfectionism. We also have people-pleasing tendencies. So when he's talking about perfect is boring, that might be a really hard pill to swallow for ADHDers, because we sometimes, even to our detriment, like I know personally, like if it's not perfect the first time, then it's not worth doing, right? Like there is that barrier to trying something new if you're going to look foolish. And it's quite difficult. And it is quite a barrier to self-acceptance, healing, love. So when he's talking about that's just a core human experience of perfect is boring. If you were perfect and there was nowhere that you could go up, I think that would be a really uncomfortable feeling. And maybe learning to accept that would help with some of the perfectionism tendencies that ADHDers have.
There's parts of ourselves that may be shameful, or things or experiences or things that we've done that we may feel shame about. We may tend to push those away instead of accept them. But if we push them away, we're not processing them. They're actually just becoming another layer on top of that true inner self.
Like I'm being the devil's advocate here. Like, why do we want to process that? Why do we want to remove these layers? Because it sounds like a lot of work. It sounds so much easier to just go about our lives the way we were going about them.
Well, you can put those things in a box and put it on a shelf, but it doesn't mean they go away. It doesn't mean that they won't haunt you. I think the last episode you had mentioned something about there may be good things, but you kick dirt on them. Sometimes we need to take a look at those situations and find what was good about them, where our true selves lied in those moments, because that's when we can maybe accept and see our true selves and maybe forgive ourselves a little bit for that dark part, that shame, those things that we feel.
It's creating a shield. It's the same vein as masking, right? So if we are our harshest critics and we're criticizing ourselves, it prevents that rejection sensitivity if someone else were to do it first. If we say, oh no, I did that badly, or that wasn't perfect, or I could have done better on that, we're hedging, right? We're saying something negative about ourselves before someone else can do it, which protects ourselves. It protects our emotions, because we do have that rejection sensitivity where any perceived rejection, it sends us into a tailspin. And so we have learned that if we hedge, we protect ourselves a little bit from that tailspin, but then we're constantly living in this negativity.
On top of that, there's something he says here. So we pull ourselves away from those aspects that we don't like. That disconnected piece is important, because that means you're actually connecting from that inner self.
It's that inauthenticity piece. If you are your own harshest critic, you do not like yourself. You are not friends with yourself. And as he says here, I'm not in a relationship with myself. Then how can I heal? That healing isn't necessarily something that has to be done to undergo trauma or grief or loss or any of those anxiety, depression type things. We're not necessarily trying to heal from that. We're trying to heal our inner world, our inner child, our inner selves, to learn, to grow, to be that better. That's why this healing exists. That's why we don't want to kick dirt on our joy, and that's why we want to be in relationship with ourselves.
Yeah, it's not about throwing dirt on it. It's about working through it.
You have to accept the parts of yourself that are still growing and still healing, because you can't just accept, back to the perfectionism thing, you can't just accept only the perfect parts of you, only the parts that you like. You have to accept the whole part and like the whole part.
People with ADHD, we deal with so many things that we're exhausted, and to be told that we need to work on something, that's hard. But I really think there's value. There is value in taking the time to work on these things and to work on that mindfulness muscle.
I would argue that it makes you less exhausted, not the healing process.
I agree.
This process will be exhausting. It's work, and you can't get to a healed state without work. But once you are more healed than non-healed or not healed, then it's less work to exist as a person, and you might get some of your energy back.
I agree with you. Yes.
Self-acceptance is not sucking it up, pretending it doesn't hurt, letting yourself off the hook, positive psychology, positive affirmations, ignoring your feelings. Self-acceptance is the first step in mindfulness, that this is tough. I've got this part of myself that needs healing and acceptance as this is my starting point. Self-acceptance does not mean you sit back on your laurels either. Self-acceptance means this is my starting point. Over the years, I've done my own personal work, started in my residency. I still see a therapist to this day who helps me with stuff, helps me grow. I've learned about my tender spots, my weak spots. And I've got this little character. I talk about little L. Little L is the stuttering, nerdy guy who shows up. He's insecure. He doesn't feel he's good enough. He's got every reason in the world for not liking himself. But now my heart and my deeper aspect says, it's okay, little L. Once we tap into our heart and that deeper self, we find that's the place of acceptance, kindness, forgiveness, compassion, and celebration. Little L is now relieved of his burden, because when L was little, he was 9 or 10 or 12 or 14 or 15. So now I take his hand metaphorically and I say, I've got this, little L. And he says, really? I say, yeah, it's fine, buddy. Are you sure? Yeah, I've got this. Can you handle all this? I say, yes. He says, thank you for relieving the burden for things I wasn't ready to do.
He's talking about growing into being his own friend.
Oh, talk more on that.
He has taken a journey, and part of this journey is finding that part of himself and understanding that that's not who he is right now, and separating himself a little bit, befriending him and giving kindness and compassion. I mean, how often have you given great advice to someone else, but not taken it yourself, not done those things yourself?
This is a very fun concept in like psychology, where you use that to help them see. So like, oh, if you could like tell a friend or help a friend in a situation, like they're in your situation, what would you tell them? And it comes to them so easily. They're like, oh, I do this. I'd help them with this. I do that. And I was like, okay, to help yourself. And they're like, oh no, I couldn't do it. And I'm like, you could for a friend. You could for a friend. And so that's what he's doing. He's doing like parts work where he's like, I'm helping my inner child, my little L. I'm relieving the burden from the vulnerable piece of me, the piece of me that experiences joy to the fullest. I'm saying, I will relieve the burden from you. I have done the growth and I have done the healing.
By going through this work, it actually makes you lighter. To me, burden means something you're carrying with you. You're allowing yourself to take some of that load off along the way. I know our all or nothing thinking, we're going to want to do it all at once. But that is not a reality. It just circles back to what you were saying about just relieving and being a lighter person. Yeah.
It frees you to be your authentic self, right? So if that, and authentic self isn't necessarily like just that inner child piece or just that, you know, who you were at 9 or 10. That's not authentic to who you are now because you have experienced more life and you have grown. There are pieces of your life that make you authentic. And when they're combined, that's who you are. And so by doing the work, by relieving the burden, by making yourself lighter, by going through this process, by self-acceptance and mindfulness, you come around to a more healed, more authentic state.
Any one of these practices is the doorway and it brings in the others automatically. That's a beautiful thing about this true self. As I accept myself, I'm more patient. As I slow down, I'm more patient. As I practice compassion, I'm more patient. As I'm doing all of that, it sits in a space of mindfulness where I understand the big picture. And to refer to the work of Kristen Neff, who says that we've got 3 components to healing, as it were: self-compassion, common humanity, I'm just like everybody else, wounded and imperfect, and then the mindfulness piece. The mindfulness is the space where we're really paying attention to the inner world. We've got to pay attention to thoughts and feelings. They're important, but they're designed to look at the outside world. They are survival. That's why fight, flight, or freeze is always right there. Are you a friend or a foe? The 2 Fs. But we mustn't take our thoughts to be truth, because it's just a thought. And we mustn't confuse a feeling with a fact. So don't confuse a T with a T and an F with an F. But because they're powerful and loud and they take up space and they're well practiced, we've got all these stories and feelings about ourselves and we believe them as reality.
That's where the beliefs are coming in. So that's one of those other layers that can be on top of the true self, is our beliefs that we have, things that we've formed along the way.
If someone says, oh, you're so lazy, you just don't try hard enough, and that turns into a thought or a feeling, and then that becomes truth and fact. The false narrative that we're telling ourselves is that, oh, we're stupid or we're lazy or we're not trying hard enough. That's the story that you're telling yourself. And that is what prevents healing, because you're not accepting truth and fact. You're mistaking them for thoughts and feelings.
We pick these beliefs up from either perceptions that we have of ourselves or others, or what society's telling us, things that we've been told from our parents or our traditions. Just because they're told to us, it doesn't mean that they're a reality.
For ADHDers, if we're telling ourselves a story, if society's telling us a story, we're going to want to make that true so it doesn't feel so bad. One way to do that is just to tell yourself that story and just make yourself believe it. The better way to do that is to tell yourself a different story.
Ah, ding, ding, ding. Tell us more about that.
If you are telling yourself one thing that isn't true to your inner core, to your inner world, to your authentic self, then it's going to cause distress no matter what you do. There's no amount of healing that you can go through to match a false story. So the way to heal, the way to uncover your authentic self, your true self, your inner world, would be to tell yourself a story that is true and factual, rather than based on what society has told you, or what the negative thoughts have told you, or what your feelings have told you, right? Sometimes your feelings do match, but there is a critical reflection piece that is needed to determine if that's the truth.
And we carry that stuff from our past into the present, and then we project it into the future. I messed up means I am messing up, and then I say I will mess up in the future. So we never cut ourselves slack.
This is the piece that we're talking about. So I've messed up in the past, and that creates the false narrative. I am messing up is how you're acting this moment based on that false narrative. You're like, I'm still messing up because I messed up in the past. And then that sets you up for a future of failure. I will mess up in the future. And it's because you're sticking to this story and you're not accepting the growth that has occurred. Self-acceptance, mindfulness, healing, authenticity, all of those keywords that we've come to so far. The growth won't happen.
And if you don't take that time to grow, it will continue to happen because you've set yourself up for it. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point.
If you practice this kind of negative thought pattern, it's reinforced. What fires together wires together. If you're thinking these negative thoughts and you're acting on them, that pattern is going to get stuck. And then that story, that false narrative solidifies, and that's where the distress comes from. And then that's why we need to heal.
We are not saying this is easy. In fact,
oh no,
there's bravery involved. There is bravery involved in taking the steps of wanting to grow.
The story that we've been told about ADHD from the DSM, from the medical doctors, it was only in boys, or it only presented this way, or it only impacted you in these ways. And those were ways that were visible to neurotypicals. And there's no acceptance of the ways that it impacts you emotionally or internally in your inner world, right? There's no acceptance of those pieces. And so through understanding, through self-acceptance, we come to learn that ADHD is not this self-fulfilling prophecy. If the story you're telling yourself is that, oh, I wish I didn't have ADHD. ADHD makes my life so much harder. I'm broken because of my ADHD. You're never going to get to that self-acceptance, that growth piece. And if you just tell yourself a different story of, I have ADHD, it's the lens through which I view the world. It's a part of me. There is community in that. There is beauty in that. There's creativity. There is inspiration. The truth, the facts, the reality of what ADHD is. If you can accept that and set aside the story that society or that your past self who was discriminated against is telling you, that is healing. That is what I want for ADHDers everywhere, self-acceptance and growth.
While ADHD is the lens through which we view the world, you should also not let it be the ultimate definition of who you are.
No, it's a part of you. And it's not a dirty or shameful or broken part. It's a part of your identity.
I've said to people in my work, have you ever learned to be your own best friend? And the people look at me, what do you mean? I say, well, you're not very kind to yourself. And they go, yeah, I'm always nicer to other people. I forgive them and I let them off the hook and I give them second chances. And of course, that can be taken too far because you can become a doormat and depressed. if you don't set your boundaries. But boundary setting also means this is my inner world and I need to nurture it. I need to look after it. I need to learn how to do it.
Brianna and I were talking the other day about your whole concept of surrendering. Watching that video, I bristled a little bit. I'm like, surrendering means loss of control. But then when I started to think about what it meant for like ADHD, what does it mean to surrender to ADHD? To me, that means letting go of all the things I should be doing and all of those judgments against myself, riding with the ADHD instead of trying to ride against it.
Use the waterfall metaphor.
Oh, yeah. One of the first things I ever learned about Buddhism was this thing about the waterfall. If you fall into the river with the waterfall and you start to fall over with the waterfall, if you fight it, you'll die. But if you flow with it, it will push you under. But if you just roll with it, you'll tread water, but eventually you'll pop up and breathe again. That's moving through it, moving with it, instead of moving against it. With ADHD, if you try to fight it, it's gonna harm you in some way. But if you can say, this is my starting point, I am who I am, and I love who I am, that gives you the opportunity to embrace it and surrender to it.
Really.
So what I'm hearing you say is that when you are distanced from your inauthentic self, if you're not in relation with yourself, if you're fighting against the current, then there's no healing. And perhaps even far. In the ADHD mind, we have all these defense mechanisms, as you were saying, with being slightly othered in the world, not necessarily knowing our place, and this concept of masking, right? So we're even further than just being inauthentic, we are trying to be something that we're not.
Accepting ourselves as the starting point.
This mindfulness piece, if you can manage the inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity in a way that is authentic to you, that is more healing than a neuronormative way of managing that. So if you can find things that work with your brain rather than against it, your waterfall metaphor of if you're fighting it, if you're trying to climb back up the waterfall to the neurotypical way of doing things, you're going to drown. If you push through and go under and come up with this self-acceptance, authenticity piece, you're more likely to be able to succeed at maintaining a healthy, balanced life.
It doesn't mean that process isn't going to be difficult.
No, you nearly drown in the process.
But you're working through it and you do become lighter, unloading that burden. That's the process. It's moving with it, flowing with it. And by flowing with it, you actually make it through to the other side.
So with this concept of the starting place of finding this deeper mindfulness and this authentic self, would this be the direction for ADHDers in particular? This is why that's important?
Yes. Let me clarify about clearing the path. We're not going to become our full authentic selves by getting rid of symptoms alone. The Western healthcare system is all about symptoms. So for ADHD, it's reducing inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. That's important because it brings you back to a more stable, settled baseline where those behaviors are getting in the way, academics, relationships, whatever. But that still doesn't give you a thriving life. It reduces symptoms. Mindfulness, accepting ourselves as the starting point is, this is where I'm at. Surrender is part of acceptance. This is it. Usually we are forced to surrender when what we're doing doesn't work. We see this in lots of other areas. When an addict finally hits rock bottom and the alcoholic says, I am powerless because all my thinking, my rationalization, my ego defenses, my excuses, my blame, my guilt, I've just exhausted myself with my own stories. Now, surrender, you're right, has this quality initially of I'm losing something. Mm-hmm. But the word render means to turn something into something else. We take eggs, flour, and water and render it into bread, cake, or cookies. There's a rendering, there's a transformation. And so surrender, we're surrendering because we're letting go of what's not working.
When you surrender, it's not the parts of yourself that are already working. It's the parts of yourself that aren't working.
Yeah.
That's what you were trying to talk about, because you said surrender was a very charged word. It triggers that fear of losing control that many of us have. And so when we surrender, it's not about surrendering the whole, surrendering our power, surrendering ourselves. It's about surrendering to knowledge and growth, setting aside the pieces that are no longer serving us and nourishing the pieces that are. And
Correct.
so there's room for them to grow. And that's what the surrender piece means.
By leaving those parts that are not serving us behind and letting those things flourish, letting them grow, actually deepens our understanding of ourselves, but it also gives us a stronger foundation in the long run.
Once you've ruminated those stories 5,000 times, you don't feel any better. Sometimes I would say to people and to myself, do you want to feel better, or do you want to keep justifying why you're doing what you're doing? Because sometimes the two are not compatible.
Okay, that piece, oh my God.
Yes, this question is such a kick in the ass.
I want this on a throw pillow. I want this like on a mural in neon lights in my home. Do you want to actually feel better, actually grow, actually heal? Or do you want to keep justifying why you're doing what you're doing?
That to me says that you have two choices. You can go through the motions and pretend like you're trying to do it, or you can actually surrender to it. You can actually go through the hard work to get to the other side.
ADHDers are very, very good at intellectualizing our feelings. We are very bad at feeling our feelings. And so this is the piece where he's like, do you want to keep justifying why you're doing what you're doing? That is what we have viewed as healing. Typically, ADHDers are like, oh yeah, no, I understand why I'm doing this, or I can talk about why I'm doing this, or I can think about why I'm doing this, but I'm not really feeling why I'm doing this. And I'm not really changing anything about it. So you're not actually feeling better or healing.
So surrender is giving something up that's not working so that you open a space for something new.
Are you talking about the concept of adaptive to maladaptive, where once the behavior served you, like fight, flight, or freeze, there was some point when that behavior or that thought or that feeling was benefiting you? We've healed, we've progressed. And now that same thought pattern of, oh, if I don't get this done in time, the world will hate me, or I'm a failure if I can't do this, has now become maladaptive and it's no longer serving us. So
Correct.
Clearing the path becomes removing what once served us to make space for things that will now serve us.
Sometimes those old maladaptive patterns were just instinct. And so with anxiety is we can shut ourselves down and we shrink our lives. And then we don't feel good about it.
Yeah.
We may not be conscious of those maladaptive patterns, and then they don't serve us anymore. Our conversation's building a picture here that as I start to pay attention to my inner world, see the value of developing a true authentic self, a flourishing life, there's more in there that I have that are human assets. I want that. Then, well, how do I do that? Now we're at the point where mindfulness brings us into self-acceptance, what it is, what it isn't. We've spoken about what mindfulness is not. It's just paying attention. Now in the inner world, we can start to heal. And my two questions are always, where am I stuck? What's called for? Not what do I do? So if I'm a very impatient person, what's called for is patience. I tend not to ruminate about the past. I tend to overthink the future because I'm a bit of an anxious person at heart. I'm often planning ahead. And as a doctor, that's part of your work. We're often thinking ahead. In my work, I've got to be thinking ahead of where are we going, what's going to be useful, what does this person need, what do I need? And I sometimes find that my tendency to overthink goes into the future. So sometimes I'm impatient and I have to pull myself back. But once I'm aware of it mindfully, I can watch for it. It's my Achilles heel. I'm impatient. Now, every single person is going to have a bit of a curriculum. One of mine is patience. Some people, it's going to be ruminating about the past. Somebody else's top issue on their human curriculum agenda is going to be, I really must stop beating myself up. For somebody else, it's going to be compassion. For somebody else, it's going to be forgiveness. As we go in, we start to identify our key woundings, and then we can work with them. And not what do I do, because that's the world of action. The mind is always wanting to translate it into something actionable. So I don't say, where am I stuck? What do I do? Where am I stuck and what's called for? And that reminds me to go to heart and soul and what kind of energy and spirit.
He talks about how like each person has gone on their own journey, right? Like whatever trauma, however you grew up, culture, place you grew up, all of our life experiences impact who we are, and it wounds us in different ways, and it heals us in different ways, and it helps us grow in different ways. Do you know where like your curriculum would be?
What courses you need to take are going to be individualized to you.
They should be, because you are an individual.
That starting point is identifying that the thing exists, and then the growth part is the curriculum. Like we were talking about, going back to the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism.
Once we've identified our wounds and we have practiced mindfulness and self-acceptance and come to this place where growth is now possible, that is where we look for what's called for, the invitation.
But what happens after that invitation? Your hand's on the doorknob. What's next? You open the door. Growth is a path beyond that door.
Exactly. So in this episode, we talked about authenticity and healing. So the first part of this series was about mindfulness and self-acceptance. That is, if we're talking about starting points, that's the starting point. That is how you begin to find the journey. Before you accept or identify that there is healing or growth that needs to occur,
you have to identify that it exists at all.
Exactly. So as you were saying with your four Buddhism things, you have to delve into mindfulness and self-acceptance. Once you are there, then you can begin on your path of authenticity and healing, finding those pain points, finding those wounds, noticing the invitations that are coming your way for growth.
And episode 3 is on integration and growth.
We're going to integrate everything we've learned and talk more about growth in part 3. So join us next week. Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Hypercast.
If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected, be sure to rate and subscribe. And check out the show notes for links to our social media and websites.
Whether you're seeking practical tips, heartfelt stories, or just a sense of community, Hypercast is here for you.
Remember, you're not alone in your ADHD journey. Together, we can navigate the highs and lows with courage and compassion.
So until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep embracing your unique neurodiversity.
Catch you on the next episode of Hypercast.